Interpreting the humanities through museum exhibits. The title alone is confusing. Now, we're pretty sure what museum exhibits are, and most of us think we know what's meant by interpretation. But humanities, now there's the problem. Well, there's a good reason to be uncertain about the word humanities, because it means somewhat different things in different situations. But I can give you one easy reassurance. The common sense understanding that humanities relates to humans is perfectly valid. Human beings, human affairs, human things. These are the concerns of humanities. One of the most common places to find the word humanities is in colleges and universities. And the academic meaning is fairly simple. Department of Humanities, Division of Humanities, Professor of Humanities, College of Humanities, courses in humanities. You'll find these in almost any college catalog. It's a term that separates certain areas of study from others. Humanities, sciences, engineering, social sciences. These are names that conveniently divide the curriculum. Another place that we find the word is in government agencies. This videotape, for example, is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and many local historical societies have participated in projects of their state humanities agencies. Now, when Congress created the National Endowment for the Humanities in 1965, it had to prepare a legislative definition. Well, here it is. The term humanities includes, but is not limited to, the study of the following: language, both modern and classical, linguistics, literature, history, jurisprudence, philosophy, archaeology, comparative religion, ethics, the history, criticism, theory, and practice of the arts, and those aspects of the social sciences which have humanistic content and employ humanistic methods. So as you see, Congress also defined humanities by discipline or specialty. I'll come back to this later, but first I'd like to present another traditional definition of the humanities. There are many who like to think of humanities as the great books: Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Poetics, Sophocles' play Oedipus the King, Shakespeare's Hamlet, from the Bible, the Book of Job, the writings of St. Augustine, of Montaigne, of John Stuart Mill, of Sigmund Freud, the Declaration of Independence, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, Milton's poem Paradise Lost, and so on and on. Great books that contain a 3,000-year great conversation about great ideas of humanity. But since we're going to talk about museums, we might supplement the great books with great things. But where do such simple places as this graveyard fit in, with their simple gravestones marking the remains of simple people? I think we can all answer the question. Humanities are wherever there is humanity. These grave markers are human things, and this distinguishes them from the sciences. And they're historic things that tell us about the past. And they are part of the great conversation about great ideas of humanity, because they converse with us today about death and about the worth of human lives. So you see why I have chosen a cemetery as the main location for my remarks. Wherever you are, New England, the South, the Midwest, Canada, a portion of your local history is here in a local cemetery. And no matter how simple and unimportant the residents of your cemetery may have been, you can connect them and it to some of the profoundest puzzles of human existence: death and grief and human worth, immortality, pride, memory, and reconciliation to death. All are there in straightforward local terms. Now, I'll expand on these thoughts later on, but let me return to the definitions of humanities. You remember that legislated definition included the odd phrase, those aspects of the social sciences which employ humanistic methods. But what are these methods of humanities that distinguish them from science, professions, and social sciences? Well, simply this: the humanities always use the past, history, as a tool for understanding. Now, the past includes not only historical facts about battles and laws and social institutions, but books and poems and paintings and buildings and monuments, both great and simple, like these grave markers. So you see, your historical museum is already humanistic, because history is inherent to the humanities. However, I'm going to put one more requirement. Just the facts of history are not enough. They must be used to connect the past to the present and to illuminate important human concerns. Okay, now let me give you a short definition of the humanities that's not only going to apply to museum exhibits, but it'll fit comfortably enough along with the academic, legislated, and great book definitions. Here we go. The humanities use the human heritage to enlighten our decisions, our actions, our lives. Okay, let's talk about exhibits. In general, we can say that there are three kinds of exhibits: displays, reports, and interpretive exhibits. All three have their uses, and, well, to tell the truth, most exhibits will overlap. As a matter of fact, the modern museum learned many of its techniques along with modern retailing. But as you look around a shopping mall or in downtown store windows, I think you'll see what are the virtues and, of course, the limits of display exhibits. Displays are often of stunningly fine design, and anyone preparing an exhibit should study both the design and technical paraphernalia of retail displays. Nevertheless, the display exhibit has a very limited use in museums. At worst, it says only that these things are here. At best, it grabs your attention, announces that these things are both important and desirable, and most of all, it draws you in to see more and ideally to make the objects part of your life. Let's put it in business terms. The display excites your interest, holds your attention, draws you in, persuades you to buy, which means, of course, that the items for sale become part of your life. But a display does not enlighten, it does not educate, it does not interpret. Therefore, in a historical museum, the main use of a display exhibit is to excite attention and to draw visitors into an exhibit that will enlighten, educate, and interpret. In other words, your use of displays should be on the main title board. Now, before I leave displays, I want to point out one other thing. The artifact that you choose for a display should be selected with care, because the display has tremendous power for bestowing importance. Notice what happens when I take one very simple artifact, which is very, very dull. It's just an old battered hymnal. And I place this thing on remove it, as it were, from a case, and I place it on a richly textured background. And there we are. It has gained some importance, and therefore, in your museum display, be sure the displayed object is really important. Okay, now, the report type of exhibit is the most common kind of historical museum exhibit. Probably the clearest example of what I mean by a report is the highway historical marker. They range from straightforward reports that something happened in the area to more interpretive reports like this marker at South Pass, Wyoming, which helps the visitor to see the landscape in historic terms, locating the remains of the Oregon Trail and the Pony Express route. Most case exhibits will be reports, really, rather than interpretations. They report such things as, this is how Indian baskets looked. These are things that were owned by a notable person. These are the instruments of a 19th century doctor. Here is how lumbermen worked. This is a railroad steam engine. Here is the house of a famous man, and so on and on. I think it's safe to say that the report exhibit is the backbone of an historical museum, just as the display exhibit is the backbone of the art museum. Report exhibits provide visitors with information. Report exhibits can provide both primary and supplementary educational experiences. And report exhibits provide diversion and entertainment. So tourists appreciate report exhibits because they provide information about unfamiliar places and activities. And teachers love report exhibits because these provide their students with authentic illustrations of what is being taught in classrooms and textbooks. Indeed, it's probably true that it is authenticity that draws people again and again into museums. The quest for the genuine seems to be a vital human need, at least in our time, when so very much is experienced indirectly through the mediation of books, recordings, radio, film, video, or facsimiles and reproductions. Thus, you see, any exhibit, from an art museum display to a report on Valentine's, is humanistic because it serves to fulfill human needs to be close to the genuine things of human heritage. It's much like what the American poet Marianne Moore said of poetry. She said, if you demand on the one hand the raw material of poetry in all of its rawness, and that which is, on the other hand, genuine, why, then you're interested in poetry. The museum visitor's demand for genuine artifacts represents a humanistic interest in history. Nevertheless, displays and reports rarely interpret the humanities. Let me explain it this way. An interpretive exhibit should directly and consciously connect the viewer and the exhibit. Or to put it another way, an interpretive exhibit should connect the present to the past. The visitors leaving an interpretive exhibit should understand not only that the exhibit is about those long dead, but somehow they should understand that the exhibit is about themselves. Now, obviously, this can't happen in every exhibit, and you'll notice that I've not denigrated displays and reports. They serve useful purposes of engaging attention and of instructing. And many, many visitors make the connections themselves, as I did looking at the highway marker at South Pass, where, standing in a cold May wind on that treeless mountain prairie, I thought of the heroic drive of human beings to better their lives, and of the unending restlessness of Americans to keep moving, feelings which I share. Yet the interpretation is what I brought, not what the exhibit gave. And maybe this is the way it should be, for the sheer power of the site is considerable, and it may be impossible for an American not to be stimulated to make such connections to our heritage. Perhaps this is sometimes the case, that people will extract their own humanistic interpretation from an exhibit, but generally, I think not. For example, when most people visit a magnificent mansion, they don't seem to be asking, who would I have been when this house was built? And they rarely think about questions of equal opportunity, economic exploitation, or conspicuous consumption. Similarly, visitors to this cemetery in Nashville tend to look for the monuments that report about the final homes of famous Confederate generals, rather than pondering on the brevity of life, the inevitability of death, and the unending hope of human beings to be remembered. Well, there are ways to assist people to make human connections in museum exhibits. A shorthand way of expressing this is what is called the thematic approach. There are many themes in the humanities, topics that have engaged human beings throughout the ages. The best ones are those that touch all people, whether great or simple. Death and all of its allied themes is one, which is, of course, why I chose the cemetery. But there are some other themes: liberty, equality, love, duty, work, justice, community. Now, these aren't trivial things, and I'm sure that some of you who are planning exhibits on, say, the building of our courthouse, or children's toys of the 1920s, or how a combine works, you may be starting to think that your projects are trivial. Certainly not on the level of liberty and justice, love and death. Well, it ain't necessarily so, because you'll remember that we're talking about interpretation in a museum. You can take something that is local, provincial, and seemingly unimportant and elevate it by an interpretation that connects it to the larger world of human concerns. The courthouse, for example, is ultimately a seat of justice. Therefore, you don't have to limit your interpretation to stone and mortar, or to the local struggles to fund the new building, or even to the architectural history and historic preservation. A courthouse is a seat of justice. And it's a certain fact that every courthouse in America reverberates with decisions that have changed people's lives. The legislation may not always have originated locally, but its administration is local. Therefore, you see, you could prepare an interpretive exhibit in your courthouse on, for example, freedom of speech in our county, or local court cases on the rights of women, or the environment as an issue in local justice. Because, you see, provincialism is a state of mind, not a necessary handicap of locality. One of the widest-ranging books of humanity is Walden, and yet Thoreau writes of only a few acres of woods and a pond. Be a Columbus, he says, to whole new continents and worlds within you, opening new channels, not of trade, but of thought. Well, our museum exhibits cannot all become New Waldens, but we should make a habit of looking alive for interpretations that will lift the viewer beyond reports about the historical past into realms of thought that challenge as much as they satisfy. Which is all very lofty, but maybe I should get down to brass tacks. How can this be done? Generally speaking, there are two ways of planning an exhibit. If you start with the theme, or you can start with the artifact. If you start with the theme, you will deduce the kinds of artifacts that are needed to exemplify the theme. While, if you start with the artifact, or a group of artifacts, you'll need to brainstorm themes that might be distilled from them. A simple example of the latter is one of the courthouse. You've got a courthouse. That's your artifact. And you want to interpret it. And you decide that a good theme would be liberty and justice for all. Then, of course, the process reverses. Because once you have the theme, you must look for other artifacts, smaller than a courthouse and bigger than a bread box, that will help to explain it. Now, starting with a theme sounds rather intimidating, especially if you're thinking of the big abstract themes such as have been mentioned. But there is a method that you can use to develop a theme that will at once address human concerns and current interests as well. This method requires that you express the theme as a question or a problem or an issue, because the concerns of humanities are not resolved. They're examined anew by each generation, and each generation tries to answer these questions, problems, and issues in terms that are meaningful in their time. A few examples of this kind of question will help. How can we guarantee everyone a voice in government? How do we recognize leaders? What are the qualities of leadership? How does a family sustain itself? How should we educate our children for useful lives? How can we make our community a good place to live? Now take that last one. How can we make our community a good place to live? This is a current issue in every city and town in America, containing myriad sub-issues like public safety, sanitation, comfortable homes, parks, theaters, downtown renewal, historic preservation, maintenance of streets, public transportation, industry, commerce, labor, and so on, and on, and on. Now, the ancient humanistic theme involved here is what's called the good life. But the responses to the quest for the good life are not abstractions, but they are real laws and real gardens and real streets and real fire engines and real museums. Now, let me remind you of our definition of the humanities: to use the human heritage to enlighten our decisions, our actions, our lives. Your interpretive exhibit has the purpose of enlightenment, not of providing answers. Your method is to show the citizens that historically your community has coped with the problem of making the community into a good place to live. But because you've chosen a genuine, current issue, your exhibit will not merely be history. It will connect the past to the present. It will provide viewers with historical perspective on today's issues, and historical perspective is one of the most useful outcomes of the humanities. Because without this perspective, people tend to view their problems as unique, unprecedented, and alarming. Let's get more specific. Crime is an urgent problem in most American communities today, and it certainly is a deterrent to our quest for good community life. But our generation didn't invent crime. Well, we've had it since Eve's theft and Cain's murder. Furthermore, through the ages, communities have searched for ways to prevent and control crime, laws and courts and police and punishments. I think that you must now see what interpretation of the humanities does for museum exhibits. Your collection of guns is no longer just something for gun collectors. Your photograph of the turn-of-the-century police force is no longer a quaint local version of the Keystone Cops. Uniforms, handcuffs, jails, laws, police records, newspaper headlines, and so on all become relevant to human concerns. You see, it's all a matter of interpretation. Another key to humanistic concerns is to think in terms of what today is called coping skills. How have we coped with an unfriendly environment, with economic disaster, with community rivalries, with cultural deprivation? Once again, by thinking in larger terms, you can adjust your exhibit to touch people today. Your log cabin reconstruction no longer says, this is how things were in the good old days, but this is how people coped with isolation. Or this is how people coped with limited living space. And it wouldn't hurt to make direct comparisons with senior citizen apartments, modern farms, or mobile homes where similar problems are being addressed today. There's no need to be heavy-handed about updating your interpretation or to take sides and say that one is good and another bad. Your task is enlightenment, not advocacy. People are wiser than we sometimes believe, and they'll make the connections and the decisions if only museum exhibitors will suggest some ways of doing so. Let me review briefly. I've provided you with several definitions of humanities, pointing out that the definitions will vary for different situations, but that all draw upon the human heritage with the belief that the past can enlighten the present. Museum exhibits are of different kinds, the display being least interpretive, and the report more informational than interpretive. And among interpretive exhibits, the most effective in touching the lives and concerns of people today are those that attempt to illuminate perennial themes of humanity. In addition, an undercurrent idea in my remarks so far is that the historical museums have a particular problem of interpretation because their collections are necessarily local and regional, carrying with them an ever-present danger of limited provinciality. The problem, therefore, is one of transcending the local in idea and thought. But I must insist without sacrificing the genuine immediacy and the unique flavor of local history and lifestyles. The solution is to employ local artifacts to exemplify larger common issues of human life, problems that are as relevant today as in all yesterdays, thereby connecting the present to the past, the locale to the big picture, and the museum visitor to the exhibit. Thematic connection, though, is only one way of interpreting the humanities through museum exhibits. Because you might have noticed that while my examples have related to topics of the great conversation, they've not really related to the documents and artifacts of the great conversation. That is to ask, where is the place for the great books and artworks in a local museum exhibit? Well, my reply is that there should be a place for the great works of the humanities in museum exhibits because, used judiciously, they have the power to distill complicated ideas into a single image or phrase that will resound through your exhibit. It seems to me, for example, that the phrases of the Gettysburg Address or the opening of the Declaration of Independence or the preamble of the Constitution have enough material to connect 1,000 little exhibits to our nation's dreams, as the Smithsonian has done with such exhibits as A More Perfect Union. And to return to the themes of death, bereavement, and reconciliation, there's an immense body of great poetry called elegies that can both enlighten and enrich the interpretation of a cemetery such as this. One thinks immediately of the English poet Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, a veritable treasure chest of famous phrases. Far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air, and so on. But there's a wealth of American poetry that can add expanded dimensions to any exhibit of funeral artifacts. Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River Anthology, for example. For this cemetery, the Southern poet Allen Tate's Ode to the Confederate Dead. Listen to the first stanza. Row after row, with strict impunity, the headstones yield their names to the element. The wind whirs without recollection. In the riven troughs, the splayed leaves pile up of nature, the casual sacrament to the seasonal eternity of death. Now, I must confess to you that although Allen Tate was a teacher of mine, I've never really cared for this poem until now. The reason, of course, is because this cemetery, this historic artifact, is dynamically interacting with the poem. And the interpretation works both ways. The poem illuminates the cemetery, and the cemetery gives the poem substance. Another American elegy that is useful is Walt Whitman's great "When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed." Think about a museum exhibit with these 3 lines. Oh, what shall I hang on the chamber walls, and what shall the pictures be that I hang on the walls to adorn the burial house of him I love? Now, if there's a better invitation to a museum exhibit, I've yet to see it, because one answer to Whitman's question is all the funereal black crepe and mourning pictures that filled Victorian parlors with lugubrious abundance, not to mention filling the storage bins of historical societies with unwanted plethora. Simple people, simple things, but worthy of interpretation because they are universally human. Your awareness of the universality of concerns of the humanities can unlock boundless potentials in local museum collections, connecting the commonplaces of everyday life to the thoughts, expressions, and histories of people in 100 wheres and 1,000 whens. Ultimately, the value of interpreting the humanities through museum exhibits is to illuminate today with the light of yesterday and to enlighten our decisions, actions, and lives with the assurance that we are not alone.